I want to thank Peter for inviting me to this. I think I want to thank Peter for inviting me to this. I'm not sure. I said yes, I'd come along and talk about the epidemiology of fruit and vegetables and cancer. And then I found that at the end there was this thing that says 3:30, summing up. And I didn't know how to get out of that. So anyway, I thought I might do the summing up before we had the meeting, because as an ex-civil servant, we always used to write the minutes before the meetings. It was much easier. So I'm a physician who's had a long-standing interest in public health. I used to work at the Department of Health for some 13 years, but not for, it was finished over 13 years ago. So I don't know whether I'm the obligatory epidemiologist that was mentioned by the Dean earlier. I wouldn't call myself an epidemiologist. I use epidemiology as a tool, and I don't do epidemiological studies, first-hand epidemiological studies myself. I don't do any studies myself now. I'm mostly doing kind of tertiary or quaternary type research, which is putting things together that other people have done, much more clever people than I. And so I work with the World Cancer Research Fund. I don't know if any of you have heard of the World Cancer Research Fund. We're a charity or group of charities interested who have been for 20 years interested in nutrition and cancer prevention, and I've been working with them for 10 years or so. But if you have heard of them, you probably heard of them a little longer ago than that, back in 1997. What was that, 15 years ago? I tend to get my decades mixed up these days. When this report came out, just before actually a COMA report that was addressing the same issue came out on food nutrition and the prevention of cancer. And one of the top lines from this, and about the same time there were WHO recommendations as well, was to eat more fruits and vegetables. And I guess if you were to go out into the streets and ask people for a nutritional or dietary message that they recognized, they would say 5 a day. In fact, they do say 5 a day because we've asked them. That's the one they recognize. And 5 a day is the message that everybody's got, and it kind of characterizes what we mean by healthy eating. And 5 a day means, mostly for people, it means a couple of apples, a banana, and maybe half a carrot at dinner time. And people don't manage to do that. And I know you characterized fruit and vegetable intake as declining. I think that was fresh fruit and vegetables. There's been a big change over decades of a move away from fresh fruit and vegetables towards more processed products. So I'm not sure how that characterizes the totality of fruit and vegetable intake. And there's clearly quite a lot of consistent evidence in relation to fruit and vegetable intake and cardiovascular disease. And according to this report from my own organization, but before I joined, a lot of evidence in prevention of cancer. And I hope I'm not going to underwhelm you with my talk today, because my work has been in this later report, which was published in 2007, which took a more modern approach. It was able to take a more modern approach, being 10 years later. But we took a very rigorous approach to looking at the evidence systematically. So it's a series of systematic literature reviews conducted around the world by independent groups, which was judged by a separate panel. And I don't want to go into the methodology in any detail, except to say that people regard this, I think, as one of the most authoritative statements on the relationship of food, nutrition, and physical activity to cancer incidence. And that's the, if you like, they call it their Bible. I like to think of it as a bit different from that, because at least it's evidence-based. So this is the 2007 report, which I'm going to show you some data from. Now, having slightly hedged my bet to start with, these are the recommendations that came out from the expert panel who didn't conduct these systematic reviews. They judged systematic reviews that were presented to them. So they couldn't have influenced the content of the reviews by that way. They preset criteria for judging the likelihood of the causality, which was almost entirely based on observational data, as well as some mechanistic evidence, but very few clinical trials of value. And in fact, clinical trials that one does get in terms of cancer incidence in ordinary populations would be very, very difficult to do, to control diets over decades, when we know that the time span of the pathology is something like 10 to 20 years for the common cancers. So what the expert panel did was they managed to come up with 10 recommendations, 8 of them for the general population, with a couple for special populations. And they're in an order of priority that puts these 3 at the top, and that's the only order of priority. And you can see that ones at the top are not to do with fruit and vegetables. They're to do with things more about your biological nutritional state, so physical activity, obesity, and the things that make you gain weight, foods and drinks that do that. And this is a direct result of the biology, as opposed to simply being a passive recipient of things in foods. fruit and vegetables are in there, but as part of a much broader recommendation on plant foods. And then there are recommendations about animal foods and alcoholic drinks and processing and preservation, etc., that talk about broadly the pattern of the diet. And I guess one of the messages that comes from this is that we really want people to think not about magic bullets, let's do this recommendation and not that recommendation, but they all have to be taken together. Because from an epidemiologist's point of view, the more you whittle down to try and identify what the component is that might be causal in relation to the exposure from the overall diet to the outcome, which is cancer, the more likely you're going to run into problems of potential confounding and bias, or confounding at any rate. And so while we can be pretty certain that you get benefit from eating more plant foods, and we can think about what components of plant foods and how much confident we can be about that separately, the fact is that if one did all of these things, you would be really, really certain that you would be reducing your risk of cancer. You pick on one of them, you can be reasonably sensitive to getting some benefit, but it's really the package together that provides you with the confidence that you're going to be able to get the health benefit. So plant foods is there, but really as a much broader category than fruit and vegetables, and I'll try and explain why that is. Now, this is one of the matrices from the report, and it's a summary matrix. I don't know, it's a bit pale. But what you can see along here, the different cancers, as well as overweight, weight gain, and obesity. Just for interest's sake, but you'd have thought, wouldn't you, that people would know from an evidence base what kind of diet makes you fat or not. You'd have thought that there'd be evidence on that. And there's a huge amount of evidence, if you go and search for it, on what kind of diets help people to lose weight or don't. But there's almost nothing on the nature of the prospective data on what people eat, how they behave, their physical activity, and what makes them fat or not. So there was very little on that. So these are the cancers here, and these are the various nutrients and foods that came out of the literature reviews that were associated with either an increased risk in red or a decreased risk, that's supposed to be blue, I can't see whether it looks blue to you from over there, with cancer. And if it's a tall bar, then it was a very high level of evidence that was regarded as convincing, and if it's a less tall bar, then it was just probably causal. And so what this shows you really is that you get this very reductionist approach to the literature. People publish what comes out positive. And there's almost certainly a large amount of publication bias in the whole literature. We did look in the report for publication bias, and so that was taken into account in terms of the judgment as to the likely causality. But what I wanted to point out here is that these cluster of blue protective plant foods, these are mostly plant foods, foods containing dietary fiber, non-starchy vegetables, allium vegetables, garlic, fruits, foods containing folate. And you can see that there's a mixture of things, some of which are a bit odd, allium vegetables, garlic, and some of which are broader, fruits and so on. But they're protective, but none of them reaches the level that managed to convince the panel that they were at the highest level of evidence, in contrast to the perception from 10 years previously. That high one there is just aflatoxins from liver, and that's a contaminant on mouldy grains. So it's not really to do with fruit and vegetables as we understand them. And all these red ones down here are to do with fatness, physical activity, being born too tall, etc., and those sorts of things. And so it's a real shift from where we talk about a diet to protect against cancer, which is what it was like 10 years ago, to maintaining a nutritional state that is more healthy. And these are also healthy for all the other chronic diseases as well. So we summarized in the report the impact of different exposures, vegetables, fruits and pulses, this category here, in these matrices, according to the level of evidence as the likelihood that these links that you find, observational links between an exposure and an outcome over time, were convincingly causal or just probably causal, or indeed if the evidence was too limited to draw a firm conclusion. There actually is a separate category which I haven't put up here called limited, just no conclusion, and that's where almost all the evidence that was looked at went into. So what you see here is the tip of the iceberg. And you can see that there's a huge amount that was too limited for various different cancers, but there were some that got into probable and none in this whole category of vegetables, fruits and pulses that was deemed convincing. And so those are the ones, they're all probably. And I have to say that the panel was starting from a position where they thought it would be difficult to overturn conclusions that had been very strongly made 10 years ago, just on the basis of some slight and less voluminous, more recent data. So most of the evidence went into here, into not limited suggestive of something going on, but too limited to draw a conclusion, and limited just a mess. If you look in more detail, you can see here that there's issues relating to starchy vegetables, mostly in relation to the upper area digestive systems where there are other causal factors. So where there are things like alcohol, smoking, Helicobacter, and other things that are the causal factors of the cancer, they seem to be an observable protective effect of vegetables or components of vegetables or fruits, or garlic and so on. And I'm trying to see, garlic and colorectum is the only one where colorectum comes out, which is the one where you really would expect to see something relating to aspirin. We do get folate, foods containing folate, and colorectum as well. And those are the ones that are inconsistent. If we look a little wider at the cereals and grains and starchy roots, apart from the aflatoxins, which I mentioned earlier, it's the foods containing dietary fiber relating to the colorectum itself. And so those are the only things that pick up. And it's characterized by the characterization of fiber. And we called it foods containing dietary fiber because the fiber was in foods, and we didn't want to jump to the conclusion that it was the fiber. It might be something else in those fiber-containing foods that was causing it, and rather than any particular dietetic categorization of foods. If you looked at fruit and vegetables, as you'll see, it doesn't really come up. If you looked at fruit or vegetables or any subcategory of vegetable, it doesn't. But if you look at the component and characterize it by that, you do find some effect. So I wanted to show you just a few, and tell me if you're getting bored of these, a few of these forest plots that show the problem that the panel was faced with. So here is some data on mouth, pharynx, and larynx. Causal factors are well known to be alcohol and smoking, and we get, here you see, a very apparently protective effect with a 25% reduction in relative risk for non-starchy vegetables. That just means excluding potatoes, basically, and mouth, pharynx, and larynx cancers. But you can see they're all case-control studies. And the same goes here. You can see this rather convincing looking dose-response relationship for non-starchy vegetables and risk in the different studies. And you can see here in the case-control studies, in the highest versus lowest exposures, you can see that there tends to be a lower risk in those with the highest exposure rather than the lowest exposure. But these are all case-control studies. And one of the problems with nutritional epidemiology, which has been shown now very elegantly, is that if you take people who have had the disease and ask them what they ate for their whole lives, they are very likely to, well, we know that they do tend to give you a biased estimate of a healthier lifestyle. They tend to remember more fruits and vegetables, more fiber-containing foods, more physical activity, being leaner, all those things. They're not lying to you, that's just how I remember it. And people have looked at this in long prospective cohort studies where the same things were measured at the beginning, and before they got diagnosed and after they got diagnosed. And the same people, you ask them in a case-control design, they give you a biased estimate of what was made in a prospective design. So it's particularly problematic, and that was not realized quite so well in 1997, but it was well demonstrated by 2007 when this report was coming. So these sorts of studies would have been regarded as really quite convincing 15 years ago, but are not regarded by themselves as being convincing enough now. In nutritional epidemiology, it may be all you've got, but it is a flawed design and you need to be cautious in interpreting it. So if you look at fruits, for instance, here's fruits and mouth, pharynx, and larynx cancer. Here is the case control studies, and you can see a 25% reduction for fruits and mouth, pharynx, and larynx cancer. And it's not significant. There's only one cohort study. You wonder why there's only one cohort study. There are lots of cohort studies. It's just not been reported. Why has it not been reported? We can guess they might be less positive. You get these dose response curves in the case control studies, but the cohort study shows a smaller and less significant effect. It's only one study. And that's part of the problem. We know that the case control studies are less reliable, but we have very little in the way of what's published in the literature in relation to what's prospective data. So that's citrus fruits. And one of the points here is that you may get more information by trying to be a little more precise in your exposure measurement. Dietary assessment is already a very imprecise measure to start with. We're basing it on food tables. One of the things we're going to need to think about is whether we can develop food tables for the 120 different classes of salicylates and knowing how their different processes are. If we want to do these kind of prospective data, best to rely on biomarkers if we can of exposure, but again, that's difficult. It's being used now in nutritional epidemiology, and it does tell you that dietary assessment is an imprecise measure. If you have a more precise measure using biomarkers of intake, then you tend to lose the regression dilution bias that can eliminate things. But this can't be due to regression dilution bias. This is recall bias. It may be true, but it may be recall bias, and we can't tell the difference just between case control studies. And so a series of different sets of exposures, whether it's non-starchy vegetables and esophageal cancer with case control studies showing an effect which is much less demonstrable in the fewer cohort studies. Same thing for stomach. You can see this tendency for green and yellow vegetables to show this. This is more persistent. As I say, coming down on a particular category, green and yellow vegetables may be a little more reliable. So in prospective data, there is still an effect of green yellow vegetables in relation to stomach cancer with dose response that looks reasonably convincing in that regard. But non-starchy vegetables as a whole doesn't tend to show it. And so trying to be clear about what exposure you're trying to assess will be important. None of these have tried to look at salicylates in the foods. So you can see. So here you can see the same thing. Fruits and stomach cancer, you tend to get an effect in the case control studies. You don't tend to get an effect in the prospective data. I'll just run on. I mean, interestingly, allium comes out, and you might think, well, why allium and garlic? I guess it's because they came out. I mean, I would be astonished if these two studies were the only two studies that happened to measure garlic consumption in relation to colon cancer. Two studies, not much to go on. They both showed positive with about a 20 to 30% reduction. And it's quite a lot of garlic, but it was shown. It's difficult to know how to interpret those things. And so this is the problem that the panel had, which is why it didn't go from convincing to no conclusion. It's just difficult to know how to handle that in the state of where most of the data, have a sort of inherent flaw. You see the same effect with allium vegetables in general and stomach cancer with a significant effect, but few studies. We did show folate intake in relation to colorectal cancer, and we now know that in relation to randomized trials, they don't seem to have an adverse effect at any rate. But you see this persistent protective effect. I shouldn't call it a protective effect. This persistent association with reduced risk in people who are taking with folate from foods. This is not just natural folates from foods. That will include the fortified foods that contain folic acid. And there have been one or two trials that have tried to tease those out, but it's quite tricky. But again, no one has tried to do the same thing to whittle down the studies in relation to salicylate intake, which is what is needed. And I know that was 5 years ago, the studies that I'm showing you. We have done updates. In fact, we're doing a continuous update. If you're interested in nutritional epidemiology and cancer, we're conducting a continuous update of all those databases, and they will be available to the scientific community as well, to make sure that we continually systematically review that evidence. It's continually put to an independent panel of experts, and reports will be put out from time to time. We put one out on breast cancer in 2010, colorectal in 2011, and pancreatic in 2012, and you can get them at our website. And those are updates. Nothing I've shown you today thus far would be any different from looking at those updates. So in summary, given that coffee's here, is there any salicylating coffee? I don't know. The evidence for an inverse association between plant foods and cancer is a bit less convincing than most people would have thought, given the hoo-ha that is made about it. But if you look at the evidence, a lot of it comes from inherently potentially flawed data, but there are prospective data that suggest that for some categories there is a useful effect. But more broadly, if you look at a plant-based diet in relation to reducing the energy density of the diet, it's one that's less likely to make you get fat and so on. And those are the main reasons that underpin the strength of the recommendation for plant foods rather than specific components of the diet in relation to cancer, which was a very big shift from how it was in 1997. The strongest evidence, insofar as it is strong, relates to those upper area digestive cancers where there are exogenous carcinogens, so it may well be that these are protecting against an exogenous agent, but are limited by the potential bias and confounding. The evidence doesn't point specifically to the main plant sources of salicylates, as far as I could tell. That's not my expertise, though, or to those cancers where aspirin has been mostly shown to be protective, but that hasn't been a main aim of the studies, and it's perfectly possible that if one looked at the exposure with aspirin, or salicylates as the exposure of interest, one could identify associations that have yet not been found. But the only things I noted to sort of conclude with are things that you've already mentioned about. I don't know anything about bioavailability, the pharmacokinetics, the pharmacodynamics, the mechanisms, indeed, by which this is working. We know what mechanisms salicylates can have. We don't know whether they're responsible for linking those exposures with those outcomes. So we've got the confounding, the bias, the imprecision in the measurements, in the epidemiology. That's why I say I'm not the epidemiologist. And I think, the idea about it being an essential nutrient and a vitamin, it's a nice idea. Let's just do the work first and see where we get to. So that's where we're starting from. Let's see where we get to. Thank you.